Hi, this is Sean Hafer, and in this tutorial, we will be modeling a clock from primitives. So this is the first of two tutorials. In the second tutorial, we will apply lighting, materials, and render it. But in this tutorial, this first part, we will just be creating the basic parts of our clock that then we'll put together and then move from there. So the first thing I'm going to do is come into Cinema 4D here, and I'm going to go up to my primitives menu. I'm going to pull down, click and hold, and I'm going to grab a tube. So now this tube will be our clock body. Now you can see when it's created, the tube is sort of laying on its back or, on its front, either way. And it is, lined up and created in our universe at the origin. So it's at 0, 0, 0. So if I come down here, I can see its position is 0, 0, 0, and its size is 200, 100, 200. Now, if I want to zoom in a little, I can always use my scroll wheel. I can also come up here and use my zoom by clicking up in my corner controls here. So I'm going to zoom in a little, just see that. Or if I have it selected, I can always just hit O and it'll center it up in the viewport. So remember those shortcuts as we're moving through. So what I'm going to do here, I've got sort of my setup of how big I want this to be. Now we're not making this to scale, but I'm going to try and use some pretty normal numbers so that it'll be a little easier to enter this. Now, the first thing about this is we want this to be the body of our clock, and this is going to be a little alarm clock. So the face will be facing us. So we need to rotate this body of the clock so that it lines up. Now we could go to our rotation tool and we could just click and drag this way. And if we hold down shift while we're dragging, it'll snap to 5 degrees. So we could go that route. We could just type it in down here as well. So I could do 90 and hit enter there. But the thing is if I go back to my move tool, now we can see this part is no longer lined up with the coordinates of our world. So our Z in our world is going back in space, but since we rotated this 90 degrees, now the Z of our local object is pointing up. In some cases, this is fine, but when we get into animation and some other things, if you can keep everything aligned, their axes aligned to the world, it makes things a lot easier. And also in this case, we're going to model everything at 0, 0, 0, since this is basically a symmetrical object. By creating at 0, 0, 0, everything will be centered on itself. So it'll keep things, make things a lot easier as far as when we're building. All right, so I'm going to undo that. And now what we can do though, instead of rotating it, if you click on your tube and you come down here into our attributes manager, which is this area right here, and we can see we have all our properties. So I'm going to click on my object tab right here. And so we've got our inner radius, outer radius. So again, this is that inner hole. Our outer radius is how big or small the outside is. Rotation segments. So let me go up here and in display in my viewport, I'm going to hold down display and go to road shading lines. You can also do that by hitting in, and then without hitting anything else, you can see all your options there. You can hit B, and that will also give you your shading with lines. So here we can see all of the polygons that will make up our tube once we make it editable. Now currently it's parametric, so that means it is being generated mathematically. And so all of these subdivisions and options are malleable. They're all updatable on the fly until we make it editable. And then it becomes locked as polygons. So what we want to do, if we look at this and we came in here and said, this is supposed to be round, but I'm getting these crazy facets. So what's doing that is our rotation segments. So let me back up a little here. And we can see as we increase these rotation segments, it definitely smooths out. So if I render now, it's a lot smoother. Now the number of segments does increase the amount of memory your computer will use, and it can increase your render times once you get into tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and even millions of polygons. But at this point, we don't have to worry about it too much. But you do need to know if you're going to be zooming in. So if we were maybe going to come in and do a really, sexy move along this edge, and at that render, and again, to render, I'm just clicking up here, this render view. You could also just hit Control or Command R to render your view. But you can see here, we're seeing a little of those scalloped edges. So if we knew we were going to come in this close to it, you want to make sure you get enough rotation segments so that looks smooth. So for this, in this case, I don't know how we're going to end up rendering. I'm going to go ahead and just go up to 180 and hit enter. So that gives us a pretty smooth rounding. So as long as this primitive object is parametric and you haven't made it editable, you can tell that by if it has the little icon next to it of the object, not just a little triangular polygon representation, then we can always come back in and change this later. If we knew we had to come in and get really close, maybe we need to go up to 280 and really crank up those polygons. But in this case, 180 is fine. So I'm going to bring that rotation segments to 180. For our inner radius, I'm going to set that to 100. And my outer radius, I'm going to make 115, so 115. All right. And now, when we talked about rotating it, down here in our orientation, this will allow us to set the orientation of the object so its axis stays lined up with the world. So in our case, instead of plus Y, which is how it is here, we're going to want to change our orientation to plus Z. So now you see it rotates it, it kind of flips it up, but it is still lined up with our world axis, which is great. All right, so we have 100, we have 115, our rotation segments are at 180. Our height, we haven't adjusted that yet, so let's make that height 75. All right, that looks good. And then we'll also go into our height segments here. And you can see these height segments are basically our subdivisions along the height. Now, if you were going to get into this and start editing and creating some more detail in here, you might need some of these subdivisions right off the bat. If you were going to start using some deformers where you're going to be bending or twisting or tapering, again, you need that subdivision. But for us at this point, I'm going to go ahead and just do one, and that will just cut down on our polygon. So that'll be fine. So we've got that at one height segment. We've got our orientation at plus Z. And we can take a peek at this. All right, so there's our sort of clock body. And so what I'm going to do now is come up here onto the tube in my object manager, double click it, and just change that to clock body. All right, so we're going. Now there's another big thing we haven't done yet. We haven't saved our file. So I came in, I opened Cinema, we just started going. So let's go ahead and save our file so we'll know where we're at. So what I'll do is come down here to File, and then we've got Save Project As. So again, if you want to save it under another name, we have Save Incremental, and that's great. But one of the other things also is Save Project with Assets. So what that will do, it will create a folder, it'll save your file, as well as save a folder inside that folder with called Tex, T-E-X, which will save all your materials. So it's a great way to stay organized, and that's what we'll do here. So let's do Save Project with Assets, and I'm going to come in and I'm going to save it to my desktop, and I'm going to call it C4D Clock. Primitives. All right, so I've got my clock here, and I'll hit save. And now if I go and look at my desktop real quick, we can see it's created a folder, C4D Clock Primitives. If I double click that, it will open up a folder here, and inside that we've got our C4D clock primitives. Now, once we create some textures, it'll create a texture folder in there for us as well. So we'll get that all going. All right, so I'm going to bring back my Cinema 4D. And let's take a quick peek. So I'm going to hit my render view up here, or Command or Control R. And that looks great. But one thing about modeling in 3D, and this is just pretty much applies to everything that you model, nothing, or hardly anything, I guess I should say, in the world has a sharp, sharp edge like this, right? Almost everything we look at has a little bit of a bevel or a fillet, you might hear it referred to. And what that does is that allows the edge to catch the light. And that's what gives us that nice little highlight. So for this here, if I hit render again, we're just getting that straight line. It's not very realistic. This is often where you can tell something is CG or computer generated. So in this case, what we can do, since it's still parametric, we can come down here and we have this little fillet area right below. So what I'm going to do is turn that on. And now you can see what it does. It creates a nice sort of bevel or fillet right here on the edge, on the inside and outside. So everywhere there was a sharp edge, we now get this fillet. And if we make that, look at that, we get that nice highlight, coming in here. So to adjust that fillet, what we can do is just come in here and type in our segments. That's how many little subdivisions are there. So right now it's 3. So if we zoom in, 1, 2, 3. And let's change it right here to 6. So it's a little bit rounder. And that's kind of big. So I'm going to go ahead and change that radius. Let's take that down to maybe 2. All right. And now if I hit O, just to sort of center that up, hit my render view. Now look at that. We're getting a nice render here. Now by default, why we're getting some light on this is by default, Cinema creates a default light. And that's basically at our viewpoint. Until we put a light in the scene. So later on in the next video, when we start adding lights, we'll see how that applies there. All right, so we've got our clock body. Let's go ahead and add some more things here. So next we're going to create a clock face. So this is where we're going to put our texture on that tells us the numbers and lets us know what time it is. So our clock face, we're going to create a disk. So up here in the primitives, and we can come over to disk. Same thing, we can go ahead and change that orientation if we want. We can go up to +Z. All right, that looks great. And let's increase those. Now you can see we're at the sort of same size. We're at 100, and that's our inner radius. So that's great. So what we can do, though, is just increase those rotation segments. And we'll just match it up to 180, which is what we had before. And now let's move that up. Now, what we can do, if we're in our move tool and we're on our object tool, you can always grab your axes and you can see it turns white when I click on just one axis, right? It moves and I can move things that way. If I grab this little controller in between, you can see it's grabbing the Y and the X, and now I can just move in those axes. So that's one way. But when you get out of here, we can always undo. So I'm sort of out of position, but I can also always come back, go to my position down here in the object manager and just type 0. And I'm going to jump to the next one by hitting tab, 0, 0, and that'll put us right back at the center. Now I know I want this to be the clock face. I want to move it forward. So let's go ahead and drag that up to maybe -25. That sounds good. I hit enter. So there we go. And I'm going to go ahead and hit File Save or Command or Control S, and that'll save our file. And we'll call this clock face. Great. So we're moving down. Our next part we need that little piece of glass that will be in front of our clock face to protect the hands, right? So I'm going to go ahead, and for this one, for glass, we want a little bit of thickness so that we can get refraction, and that's the bending of light through an object. So we're going to go ahead and give this a little thickness. So we're going to use a cylinder instead of a disc. So I'm going to come down here, go to cylinder. Another way we could get this, if we go to create, primitive, cylinder over here, that's another way you can get to them. So I'm going to create that cylinder. Again, let's change it up to a positive Z. That's great. Now it's in the same direction we need. If we look at our radius, so our last radius was 100. So we could do that. Now the thing with glass is, in Cinema 4D at least, if you want your glass to sometimes intersect through slightly other polygons to get the effect you want. So I'm going to go ahead and make our radius 101. And then let's just give its rotation segments 96. And we'll give it a height of just 1. Not height segments, but just its height. And now we can see that's a really thin disk, and it's nestled in there a little bit. So what we want to do, we know this one's at -25, so we want to move this up a little, keep it inside of our bevel, so maybe -30. All right, that looks great. Yeah, that'll be fine. And we can always adjust these later if we need to, and that will be our glass. Okay, great. Now our next piece we're going to make is our little center post for the cylinder. So right now our glass is not transparent and we're not going to texture until the next tutorial. So what I want to make sure we do here, we'll go ahead and hide this. So one way you can hide things is if we come up here, if it is something that's being generated, so it's a parametric object or some of our other things like extrudes and lofts and lathes, you can go ahead and just uncheck this checkbox. Now if we hit render, it's not going to show up, right? So that's not there anymore. And then we can just generate it again. Now if you have something that's been made editable and you don't have this check mark here, these little dots here, these little gray dots along the layer, if we go to the glass and we say, if we just click the top one, this top one is how it will render in the render view. Okay? So by default, it'll just do whatever it's doing. It'll render fine. Green means it'll render even if it's a child of an object that is set not to render, or there's some other cases, which we'll get into later, where that could happen. So green means it will always render. And red, much like a stoplight, means it will never render. Okay, so right now, if we hit render, it will not render in the picture viewer. All right. Up here, if we go into our bottom one, this is then what will render when we go out to the render in the picture viewer. I'm sorry, before I said render in the viewport, this is what I meant to mean. So if we click this middle render button, this will render to the picture viewer, and this means it will render out there. So if I have the top one gray, we can see it's here. Here's the glass, right? But if the bottom one's red and I hit render to picture viewer, you can see it's got that little, it's not rendering. So that's great. So what we're going to do is just turn them both off and we'll be fine for now. But that's how those will work. And so we'll be using those a lot through all the different tutorials, and you'll get pretty used to that pretty easy. Okay, so that's hidden now. So now what we're going to do is create our center post. So our center post, we're going to use a cylinder. So let's go ahead and create a cylinder. We will change its orientation to +Z, just like before. Now on the cylinder here, let's go ahead and make its radius something like 4 maybe. Let's do 4. Okay, great. And we'll make its height 18. Now I'm going to pull this out a little bit and see how big this is. Okay, that's great. I am going to just stick this through here so it looks to find a point where I think it looks good. And when we start adding our hands and that type of stuff, we will figure out where exactly that needs to be. But I think that's fine for what we're doing here. So I'm going to zoom in now. Again, we want to give this a bevel, and maybe we need some more rotation segments. So let's go to rotation segments, and let's take that up to Oh, I don't know. Let's maybe do 36 because that's pretty small. We're not going to be zoomed in probably too much for that. But then if we go over to our caps here and we can go height segments, we can take that down to 1 to get rid of some polygons there. And let's go to our caps. And on segments, let's take that. Oh, segments, let's keep that at 1. And you can see what segments are. That's just how many subdivisions are inside the actual cap. And we could turn the caps off if we wanted, so just by checking that. And then we'll go to fillet here. And again, let's bring our segments to maybe 5 so we get some rounding. I just want kind of a little bevel. I don't want it to be that big. So let's bring that down to maybe 1 centimeter. I think that'll look good. Okay, we get a nice little bevel. Now if we pull out, that'll still catch the light just a little bit and give us a nice highlight there. Great. And let's call that center post. All right, and I'll hit my Control S or Command S to save, just to make sure everything's good. And now we'll go ahead, and that's a good point here. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create a little handle for the top, and we're going to create this out of 3 pieces. So we could model everything in here and keep things moving, but what I like to do is create separate files so that I can work, and then you can copy and paste in between your separate files or separate projects, and it just makes things a little easier sometime. So what I'm going to do is just come up File, New Project, and you can see it creates a new one. If we come up to Window, we can see our other project right here, C4D Primitives. And then I can come down to Untitled 2, and that's great. So in this case, we're going to need 3 objects. So let's first start off with a cone. So I'm going to create a cone. Again, everything will be at the center. On the cone, what I want to do is come in here, go to my object, make sure I'm over here, Model, right? And we've got the cone selected. So down here in my Attributes Manager, I'm clicking on Object. And with cones, you can add a top radius as well. So you don't have to, it doesn't always have to be a point. So I'm going to come in here and change that to 5. And now my bottom radius, let's make that only 10. And this is way too tall. So we'll go ahead and change our height to something like 30, 35. Yeah, that looks good, 35. Let's keep it at 35. All right. Now what we're going to do here is when we put this on top of our clock, we're going to stick this inside it a little bit. And we are also going to put a little sphere on top of here. So we don't have to worry about any fillets on the caps or anything like that here. So we can leave those alone. But we do want to make sure is our orientation is right. It's up and down. That's plus Y. That looks great. And maybe I'm going to take that up to 32 just for the rounding to be safe. And again, I can go to my display, rotating lines if I want to see that. And we don't need those height segments, so we could take that down to 1. All right, that looks good. And we'll call this, I don't know, handle post. And then what we can do, let's create a little sphere. Come in here, sphere. Again, we want to bring that way down. That's way too big. So our sphere, radius of 10, and we can bring that up and just sort of nestle it on top there. That looks good. And again, to move that, all I did was just click on my y-axis and bring it up and eyeball it in there. Now, if I go to my multiple views here, and by clicking up here, I can see from my front view. All right, that looks good. Everything looks fine. Give it a little render. Great. Okay, now I'm going to just stay in my front view for this one. Now let's create our last piece for this little handle, and that's going to be a torus to create the little ring. Oops, didn't mean to do that. So hold down here, and we'll come down to torus, T-O-R-U-S. And again, we're going to move this to an orientation of plus Z. And we want to shrink this down. Now we can always eyeball it, right? We could come in here and shrink it down some if we wanted. But I know for this one, we want this ring radius to be 25. We want the pipe radius to be 2, and we want its orientation on plus Z, just like we had. And let's take a look at this. We can just move it up on the Y, sort of center it up there. And again, since everything's at 0, 0, 0, we don't have to worry about moving things forward and back on this one. And we can take a quick render. Depending, again, how close we're going to be, that might not be enough segments. So let's go ahead and add, maybe go to 64. See if that's better. Maybe 96. Okay. And again, depending how close we're going to be, but that'll keep it safe. And that's not all that crazy. Great. So now we've got this handle, and we'll change this, double click it, call it ring. Now we could copy and paste these objects over. But what I want to do is to make this easier to handle and to move around, let's go ahead and combine these. So we can do this a couple ways. So you can sit here and shift click, 1, 2, 3. And then, or we could click and drag out here and just sort of marquee those in, right? We could select them that way. And then once we have those, we could go up to Object and then Group Objects. And what that will do is that it will create a new null object, and it will put the ring, the sphere, and the handle post into that null as children of that object. So if I come in now and say, double click the null, then I can just call this handle or clock handle. All right. And I can roll that up by clicking on this little plus minus sign. And then if I come in here, click that, hit copy. So Command C or Control C, come over to Window, go back to our previous one, C4D clock primitives. And then if I paste, that'll paste everything right in here. And then I can just make sure I'm on my Move tool and my Object tool, click on the whole parent there of clock handle, and then I can just pull it up and nestle it in there where I need it. Okay. Let's see how that looks. Give it a quick render. And now that we've got this over here, I'm going to go ahead and do one more save. All right, that looks great. Now what we could do here is we could go back and model again, but I think something new for the leg. But what I want to do is I'm just going to use this post and this little sphere as our legs for our clock. It'll give it some similar design language and keep everything sort of looking similar. So in this case then, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my clock handle here, and I am going to click and drag, and when I start dragging, hold down Control or Command, and you can see it turns into a little plus, and that creates a duplicate. So I'll undo that. So again, click and drag, hold down Control, let go, and you get a duplicate. Or we could also just click it, do a little Command C or Control C, Control V, and copy and paste that way as well. So however you want to do that, you can do that. And first off, I'm going to double click this and name it leg. And then I'm also going to roll down and delete that ring. Okay, so we've got this. And for clock handle, the one we want to leave as a handle, I'm going to go ahead and turn that off so that we can just see the leg we've got going on here. So what we want to do is we want to rotate that around or move it around so that it's sticking out this way, and then we'll have another one sticking out the other side. So there's a couple ways to do this. We could rotate this and move it around and try and line it up. But another way we could do this is if we take our leg here, our null object, and I'm going to go to my front view just so we can see it a little easier. What we really want to do is just rotate this around. So we want to rotate it around the center of our object. So since this leg is here, now when an object is parametric, you can't change its center point because it's being created from it. But when it's editable or if it's a null, you can change its center point or its rotation point. So right now I'm going to click on leg. I'm going to come over here and click on my axis tool. So enable axis. Now a lot of times, so this is something that you need to watch that you don't accidentally have this turned on. And L is the shortcut. So sometimes you might be typing something and you might accidentally hit L and then you go to move something and all it does is move the axis and you're not sure why. Double check that you don't have your axis tool on. That's just something that happens a lot. All right, so what we could do is once we have this selected and I'm up in my move tool and just leg is selected, not sphere or handle post, I can move my axis down here, right? And then when I go to rotate, it will make sure the axis is turned off. It will rotate around that new spot. But I'm going to undo that because I know since I started everything and everything is at 0, 0, 0, if I now go up here, turn on my axis tool, turn on move, I could start moving it here, or I could just automatically come down to my coordinates manager down here and type in 0, 0, 0. Now that will move our axis, and I turn this off or hit L to disable it. Now if I go to R for rotate or click up here for rotate, again, have the leg, because if the leg rotates, the sphere and the handlers are going to move with it because the null object's the parent. Then I can just rotate around, hold down shift maybe, and let's go to 145 degrees. All right, so we can either rotate and shift, or you can just come over here and on your bank, your HPB, your banking, type in 145. All right, that's great. Now, so in this case, we can create another one, or we can create an instance, which is just sort of a copy that does whatever, like if you add a material to one, or if you scale it or do other things, it will do what it does. So we'll go ahead and create an instance for the second leg. And for our instance object, I'm clicking on my third sort of icon over where the subdivision surface is and coming down here to instance. Now, whatever you have selected, the instance will automatically make a copy of it. If you didn't have anything selected, this little reference object would maybe be empty, and then you could always just grab an object and drag it into it, and that will create your instance. So this will say leg instance. And now if we just go over here, start rotating, we want to take that to 215, or if you click and drag like I did, just do a 70 degrees. All right, now we've got our legs there. That looks great. And let's take a peek and see where they're at. Now they're right in the center because they're at 0. So what we could do is just go ahead and shift select these two. And I'll go E for move, and for my top view to see where I'm at, click on my Z-axis only, and then I can just move those up a little. That looks great. All right, and there's our clock. So these two legs, we could go ahead and we could group those if we wanted, or we could group everything and just create a clock, right? So if I go Shift Select, and before I did my object, group objects, but you can also just do Option or Alt G, and that will group them, create a new null. You can see everything's in there. And then that null we can just name clock. And what's great is now if we need to move the clock as one thing, we can just move the clock and everything comes with it. Okay, but we can still get in and do anything here. So let's turn back on our clock handle. All right, that's great. And we can take a look here. There we go. We've got our clock happening. And everything's looking pretty good. Let's create one last little sort of use a little sphere on the back here maybe to create a little extra leg. So let's go ahead and create a sphere. And let's take that down to something like 12, 13. Let's see how we look. Let's go to side view. and bring it down so it lines up kind of with the, in line with these guys. So I'm going to go ahead and set it up. Yeah, that'll be fine. So we're just kind of line it up where that would hit, and then let's just pull it back in here. All right. And again, we're just making pretty pictures with this one. We're not doing anything engineering wise or anything that would, keep things that has to be exactly perfect. We're eyeballing this one, so it's okay. So now we've got a nice leg in the back, just with that sphere. We've got our little handle and our two legs, so we're in a good spot. So make sure we save, File, Save Project, or Save Project with Assets, either way. And so everything here looks pretty good. Let's take that sphere, call it back leg. And we can drag that and just drop it in the clock. All right, so that's in there. The last thing we'll do is let's create our hands. And we're going to use some texture maps and some with alpha channels to create our hands in the next video. But in this case, let's just go ahead and start those hands and get them in here so we're ready to use them when we get to the next phase. So I'm going to create a plane. And we are going to take this plane and let's go ahead and make that on our plus Z, because we're going to just put our hands in this direction. And on that, we are going to make that width 11. We are going to make that height only 85. And we are going to give it segments of 1 and 1. All right, I think that looks good. And now what I'm going to do is bring this out so I can see it. Okay, that looks good. Now with these hands, the big thing will be lining that up to the center, right? Because we want these hands to rotate around their end. So we will do that once we texture them. So in this case right now, I'm just going to leave it here, keep it as a parametric object, but we will call it minute hand. All right. And now what I'm going to do is just going to take this, copy and paste, and I'm going to change this to hour hand. And in that case, our hour hand is pretty much everything's the same, except for it's a little longer, right? Or a little shorter, sorry, a little shorter. So we'll make that 70. And I think that'll be good. So now we've got our minute hand and hour hand, so we can take those, shift click, drag them into the clock, and we are good to go. And I've got a little extra capital L there, so let me move this back. All right. So in this case then, we have sort of set up our clock. We've used primitives to create everything here. So we've got our, let me move these hands out a little bit so we can see them. There we go. So we've got our clock, we've got some hands, we've got a body, all these things made from just primitive objects. So a lot of the things you can do by combining simple shapes, by creating fillets to give some nice highlights for our light to catch. Also, don't forget using that upper radius on that cone, right? Where you might think, oh, I have to shrink it, or I'm going to have to do something with scaling, make it editable. Nope. A lot of these primitives have all kinds of great features that we can use to get that going. So I think this is where we'll end this tutorial. And in the next one, we will get into creating some lighting, some materials, and setting up renders and getting some nice images out of this. So I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks for watching.